Hello and welcome back to our study of the Law of Moses. Today we're starting with the property laws. We're going to begin with inheritance as we look at the property laws. As we noted over the past few weeks when we looked at the marriage laws, marriage in antiquity was primarily about producing legitimate heirs to receive the inheritance. That's because inheritance is one of the most central concerns in ancient law. Right? It's all over the place. And that's because inheritance is the way that most property, especially land, is transferred in antiquity. So laws concerning property make up the bulk of ancient law codes. Because property is super, super important. Not much has changed, by the way, between then and now, at least in that regard, that property is really, really central to the law. Because the majority of disagreements in the ancient world, as well as in the modern world, center around who owns what and what you can do with your own property. Right? Even laws that don't seem like they are about property at first blush really are about property ultimately. Like property is there in the background at the very least. These kinds of laws are so prolific in the ancient world. And a lot of them are so similar to modern law that I don't think it would be a very beneficial use of our time to go through many of the property laws from other ancient law codes. So today we're going to focus our time mostly in the Law of Moses. And when you look at these other ancient Near Eastern law codes, like the laws of Hammurabi and the Hittite laws, most of these laws mostly boil down to don't take other people's stuff, and you are responsible for what your stuff does. You know, what we would call liability law in the modern day. Now, at this point, I feel like I need to note that when I present it that way, you know, the property laws in the ancient world boil down to don't take other people's stuff, and you are responsible for what your stuff does, right? We might be tempted to just immediately think, oh, that's just libertarianism, right? And as we go through the laws, there will be points where, you know, if you're of a slightly different, I say slightly, if you're of a really different political bent from libertarians, you would be inclined to look at the law and say, oh, well, that's socialism right there. What I hope to demonstrate as we go through these laws is that the Law of Moses is really its own thing, right? And that that's true also of the ancient laws in general. That they are really their own thing, right? First off, the Law of Moses does not just boil down to those two principles. Don't take other people's stuff, and you are responsible for what your stuff does. Now, those are present in the Law of Moses, but that's not all that the Law of Moses has to say about those things. And as we're going to see, I hope, the Law of Moses presents us with a view of property that does not fit neatly into modern boxes, right? If you try to shove the Law of Moses into the libertarian box, you're doing damage, a lot of damage to the Law of Moses, and you're just not going to understand it right. The same thing goes if you try to shove the Law of Moses in the socialist box. Again, you're doing damage to the law, and your understanding of the law is wrong, right? So we need to resist the urge to put these ancient laws into modern boxes. Right? That's just a general warning as we go through our study over the next couple of weeks. But we can see how prolific property law is just by looking at the Ten Commandments as a sort of example. Right? 2 of the 10 Commandments deal directly with property. Right? You shall not steal, and you shall not covet. All right, so already 1/5 of the 10 Commandments deal directly, explicitly, with property. Right? And there we see the Ten Commandments keep it nice and simple, just like it always does. Right? In a perfect world, this is how things would work. You don't take your neighbor's things, and you don't even desire your neighbor's things. We'll get more into that mentality, that attitude, in future lessons. But notice, again, it's really simple. If we lived in a perfect world, that's all we would need to know. Don't take your neighbor's stuff. Don't even want his stuff. You have your own stuff. But when we look at the commandment against coveting, we begin to see that property concerns are behind more of the Ten Commandments than just these two. Right? The commandment regarding coveting, it commands things that we would normally expect. Right? It talks about coveting things like houses and livestock. Right? But it also includes a prohibition against coveting your neighbor's wife. Now, as it's included in the coveting law, right, it goes beyond just matters of lust. Right? This is not the coveting law just kind of breaking off on this tangent about lust. Because in antiquity, coveting your neighbor's wife is also a violation of property. Because everyone and everything in the father's household is considered his property. And we might as well get this out of the way now, because we're going to be studying a lot of laws that speak this language, as it were. The view of property that the law of Moses takes is expansive, and it includes people. Right? Men in the ancient world owned their wives, they owned their children, they owned their servants. Right? So that's going to, in our study, that's going to take us some places that might be awkward for us today. We'll get there when we get there. But let me just lay it out now. As we look at all of these property laws, the assumption is if you are the head of your household, and especially if you are the head of a clan, I mean, everything in that household and everyone in that household belongs to you. Everything and everyone is property. And so whenever you are coveting your neighbor's wife, well, it makes sense for the law to include your neighbor's wife in alongside your neighbor's house and your neighbor's livestock, right? Not to be insulting to the wife. But again, just to point out that the prohibition against coveting it includes anything that your neighbor owns. You do not desire anything that your neighbor has. Now, this also tells us that some of the other commandments are also, they at least touch on property. Right? So, for example, if coveting your neighbor's wife is a property concern, right, because the wife is property, then the law of Moses also, then, the adultery law in the Ten Commandments is also not just about sexual sin, right? It is about sexual sin, but it is also about a violation of a man's property, right? And that makes sense when we consider all of the things that we've been talking about, why people got married in the ancient world. They want to produce legitimate heirs to pass down their inheritance. And you can see how adultery is not just a matter of infidelity in the ancient world. It's also an assault on a man's property, because you're messing with the production of legitimate heirs. When you look at the rest of the Ten Commandments, we also find that the Sabbath law is a form of property law. The Sabbath law not only prohibits a man from working on the Sabbath, but also prohibits him from abusing his property to produce gain on the Sabbath, right? Because otherwise a guy could just say, well, you know what, I'm not allowed to work on the Sabbath, but that doesn't mean I have to go destitute on the Sabbath, right? I can still be, I can have the land produce things, I can get things done. But no, the Sabbath law is very specific. Not only are you not going to work, but you can't work any of your property. Whether we're talking your servants or your livestock, you cannot work them on the Sabbath. Right? And by the way, we already begin to see in that law that the law of Moses does not recognize the unrestrained right of the property owner to do whatever he wants with his property. Right? Again, just going back to the tendency to try to shove the law into modern boxes. Right? If you're coming at things from a libertarian perspective, in this case, right, more than likely you hold to the unrestrained right of the property holder, the property owner, to do whatever he wants with his property, or something very close to it. One thing that we're going to find in the law of Moses is that right is not recognized. A lot of the property laws that we're going to look at in future classes are restrictions on what you can do with your own property. Now, as we'll see later on, some of the other Ten Commandments also deal essentially with property. Believe it or not, the prohibition against false witness is also intimately related to property. That connection probably is not obvious right now, but we'll deal with that in future classes. But just bear that in mind. The prohibition against false witness is not just about justice. It's not just about lying. It is about those things, but it also touches on matters of property in ways that we'll see again in a future class. All right, now that gives us just a really brief kind of introductory overview of the subject. Right, we see it is very, very prominent in the law. All right, again, 1/5 of the law deals directly with and explicitly with property. Right, but if you include things that deal with property implicitly, that's half of the Ten Commandments. It's very, very important in the law, and as we'll see as we go through our study, there are tons and tons of laws outside of the Ten Commandments that deal with property. But we're going to begin with inheritance. So let's turn our attention to inheritance in ancient Israel and how that worked. Now, inheritance was just as important for Israel as it was for the rest of the ancient Near East. All right, if you're living in the ancient Near East, the inheritance is not just the family land. Right? It's not just what has been passed down from father to son in your clan for generations. It is that, right? And that's super important in the ancient world, just like it's still important in the modern world in a lot of places. Right? I mean, you see it a little bit less in the modern West, especially with people who were raised in the city. But even today, even in our country, if you were raised out in the country, out in rural areas, land is still really important, right? Like I mean, just me personally, I would rather cut off my left hand than sell any of the family land. Right, and woe betide any son of mine who ever sells Adkisson land. Right, I don't know, this is the kind of thing that maybe reveals more about me than about the subject, but, I've lived outside of Illinois for almost half of my life now. I'll probably always consider myself an Illinoisan, because that's just where my family is from. That's the land that we have held for quite a long time. And I feel deeply connected to that land. So it's not something that just, maybe I belong in the ancient world. Maybe that's what I'm saying. But I don't think that this concern for the land is just something that resides in the ancient world. It's something that we see in the modern world too. But in the ancient Near East, the inheritance is not just about that. It is also a matter of one's place with God. Now, in Israel's case, this should be obvious to us, but bear in mind this is the way that pretty much all of Israel's neighbors understood their inheritance as well. All of the pagans considered their physical, like their geographical place in the world to have come about because of their gods, right? In fact, we even see like Jephthah buying into that model, right? Whenever he's negotiating with the king of the Ammonites, he he says, look, we're living in the land that our God gave us. Your God, Chemosh, has given you your land. Why can't you live in the land that Chemosh has given you? Right, and that might make you stop and scratch your head for a minute. If you don't realize that all of Israel's pagan neighbors in the ancient Near East believed that their God had established them in their land. So if you were a Moabite, you believed that Chemosh had put you in Moab. If you were an Ammonite, you believed that Molech put you in your land. Right? If you're a Philistine, you believe that Dagon, or one of those deities, put you in your land. Now, where the Old Testament subverts things and corrects things is that we come to understand through the law that it's ultimately the God of Israel who's responsible for all of that. Right? And so Israel rightly understands that the land that they're living on is the gift of God. God gave Israel the promised land. But more than that, right, more than just giving Israel in general, the promised land in general, he gives each family its specific place in the promised land. Right, turn to Numbers chapter 26. We're going to read verses 52 through 56, and we'll look into the way that God lays out the inheritance. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Among these the land shall be divided for inheritance according to the number of names. To a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance, and to a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. Every tribe shall be given its inheritance in proportion to its list. But the land shall be divided by lot. According to the names of the tribes of their fathers they shall inherit. Their inheritance shall be divided according to lot between the larger and the smaller." So remember, this is happening on the tail end of the second census, right? For that second generation, the wilderness generation, and God tells Moses that the inheritance is going to be divided by lot, not just for the tribes, but also for the clans. Dividing the land by lot means that it is God himself who gives each tribe and each clan its inheritance. Right? And remember, there's no such thing as luck, right? That's a pagan god that you're talking about. Whenever Israel cast lots, that's God communicating his will to Israel. Right? Where does God want Judah to live? He wants Judah to live there. All right. What about the specific clans within Judah? Well, God wants this clan to live here, and he wants this other clan to live here, and so on and so forth. That's the way that the entire promised land is divvied up, is by lot, so that God's not just responsible for bringing Israel into the promised land, but he is also responsible. He chooses specifically what land is given to each tribe, and what land within those tribes are given to each clan. And the law then establishes, like we'll see later on, that it is the will of God for each clan's inheritance to stay within that clan forever. Right? We'll see that when we look at the daughters of Zelophehad. We'll also see it later on in the redemption laws of Leviticus 25. But God is involved in this. This is God's choice. This is God's will. And this choice that he makes for Israel is supposed to be permanent. So once the tribe is settled into the land, and once the clan is settled into its land, how does inheritance work from there? Most inheritance, and this is true of the ancient world in general, most inheritance is patrilineal. Right? That just means that it passes from father to son. So fathers own almost all of the property. The property was passed down from father to son. We saw this is kind of assumed in that law that we just read in Numbers. The inheritance is given according to the names of their fathers. There are exceptional cases, of course, like the daughters of Zelophehad, but generally, inheritance is handled in a patrilineal sense. Now, the most important part of a man's property, as we have seen, was land. Land was inherited. We have what's called partitive inheritance in the ancient Near East. So, if you imagine, this might be helpful to just imagine it as a square. If you've got a plot of land, and you are passing it down to your sons, each of your sons receives an equal share of the father's land, except for the firstborn son, who receives a double portion. Right? So if we can just keep this to really easy geometry. If you imagine a square representing a man's land, and let's say that man has 3 sons. So each of the 3 sons is going to inherit a share. The oldest son is going to inherit a double portion. So that land, that square, is going to be divided up into quarters. Pretty easy to imagine. The oldest son is going to receive 2 of those quarters. So he gets half of the land. The other 2 sons each get a remaining quarter. Now, if you think that through for a little bit, you can imagine what kinds of problems that could cause. It's not difficult to imagine. We'll come to some of those problems later on, as we talk about debt and as we talk about the kinsman redeemer. But at this point, those shouldn't be too difficult to imagine. How sustainable is that practice to keep dividing up the land in that way, especially if the land for the clan never changes, right? But the population of the clan can. All right. Again, we'll come to that later on. Now, we find this established, by the way, this double portion. We find it established in Deuteronomy chapter 21. We're going to start in verse 15, and the law starts talking about something other than inheritance, but then it becomes apparent that the law is about inheritance. So Deuteronomy 21:15. If a man has 2 wives, the one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him children, and if the firstborn son belongs to the unloved, then on the day when he assigns his possessions as an inheritance to his sons, he may not treat the son of the loved as the firstborn in preference to the son of the unloved, who is the firstborn, but he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the unloved, by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the firstfruits of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. So we find that the man in the ancient world couldn't write his sons out of his will, as it were, right? There's a will in a sense, right? That's what this law is talking about. Whenever the guy sits down to divvy things up, when he assigns his possessions as an inheritance to his sons, there is a will involved. But he can't choose to exclude any of his legitimate sons from his will. His sons each received equal portions, and he had to give the firstborn a double portion. There's not supposed to be any playing of favorites. Now, this is infamously subverted in different stories in the Bible, right? Most infamously in the case of Jacob and Esau. Right? Esau is the firstborn, and he also happens to be Isaac's favorite. So you would assume, yeah, he's a shoo-in to receive the double portion. But whenever Rebekah is carrying them in her womb, God tells her that the younger son will have the preeminence. And we find this fulfilled in a couple of ways. Jacob ends up with the birthright, right, with the right of the firstborn, even though he's not the firstborn, because Esau sells it to him for a bowl of stew. Right? Infamous story. But I want us to notice the way that Moses characterizes this transaction, by the way. If you look at the last half of Genesis chapter 25, verse 34, so this is I think the last thing that is said in Genesis 25. Thus Esau despised his birthright. right? The fault is Esau's for not treating his inheritance with the respect that it deserved. Again, you got to recognize just what a big, big deal this is in the ancient world. And Esau's in the wrong. He despised his birthright. He traded away that double portion for a bowl of stew. He's still going to end up with a portion. At least he's, technically supposed to. But this is, the law is supposed to prevent fathers from playing favorites with their sons. We see that Isaac ends up, again, trying to play favorites with Esau, even though God has said otherwise, right? That's what the blessing incident is about. We also then see that Jacob turns around and plays favorites with his sons, right? Giving Joseph this, special, either multicolored or long-sleeved coat, however you want to translate it, this special jacket. He plays favorites with Joseph, right? So, and the law doesn't make people perfect, but the law addresses people's imperfections. And in the inheritance, there's at least not supposed to be any playing favorites. Now, what we've seen so far in the law is normative in Israel. But we've also seen that what is normal can be subverted. All right, so let's turn our attention to the exceptional case, the subversion of the inheritance laws, the case of Zelophehad's daughters. Now, the first that we hear of Zelophehad is in the second census, going back to Numbers chapter 26. This is what we read in verse 33. Now Zelophehad, the son of Hepher, had no sons, but daughters. And the names of the daughters of Zelophehad were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. All right, so Zelophehad has inherited, or is set to inherit, because he's father of his household. So if he were to go into the promised land, he would receive a portion in the promised land. But what we read about him immediately suggests a problem. Right? Who is going to inherit his portion in Israel? Because he doesn't have any sons, and property passes, again, from father to son. Who's it going to go to? Is it going to go to somebody else, somebody outside of his family? If that happens, then Zelophehad essentially disappears from Israel. So this situation causes some changes in the law. Right? This is what we call case law, where the law is laid out, but there are, a specific case brings to light some uncertainties in the law. And so judgment is rendered, and the law is essentially made more specific in its application. We find that happening, right? So the law here is not something that is, in one sense, it is literally set in stone, right? But in another sense, it's not set in stone. That we find it being something that God adapts and changes as these situations come up. And again, Zelophehad is the classic case of that. We read the first bit of case law related to these daughters in Numbers chapter 27, in the first 11 verses. Here's what we read. Then drew near the daughters of Zelophehad, the son of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, from the clans of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. The names of his daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, and they stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest, and before the chiefs and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, saying, Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah, but died for his own sin. And he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers. Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord said to Moses, The daughters of Zelophehad are right. You shall give them possession of an inheritance among their father's brothers, and transfer the inheritance of their father to them. And you shall speak to the people of Israel, saying, If a man dies and has no son, then you shall transfer his inheritance to his daughter. And if he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. And if he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. It shall be for the people of Israel a statute and rule, as the Lord commanded Moses. First off, notice the daughter's main concern, that their father's name will be taken away from his clan. He will essentially cease to exist. Now, we'll have more to say about that whenever we look at the spiritual application of these laws in just a minute. But I want you to bear that in mind. That's their concern. That's what they bring before Moses and the elders. The Lord establishes, based on this case, that daughters can inherit if they have no brothers. The Lord also establishes a line of succession if a man dies completely childless. All right, so here are all of the backups. Right, and that's, as we just read it, that's a whole lot of law coming out of one case. Right, and we're still not done with it. So the Lord handles the specific complexity that's brought before him, and then also kind of extrapolates from that, right? Gives us some additional law, right? Just in case, so like the norm is the son inherits. Well, what happens when the son can't inherit, right? That falls apart. So you need a backup. So the Lord not only provides the backup, but also a backup to the backup and a backup to that. And again, so a lot of case law coming out of this, and we're not done with it yet. That bit of case law from Numbers 27 leads to another problem, right? So even though the Lord has, again, given some backups to that, he has sussed things out even further than asked, there are still some other problems, which gives rise to more case law. We read about this at the end of Numbers chapter 36. We'll read the first 9 verses. The heads of the fathers' houses of the clan of the people of Gilead, the son of Machir, son of Manasseh, from the clans of the people of Joseph, came near and spoke before Moses and before the chiefs, the heads of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel. They said, The Lord commanded my Lord to give the land for inheritance by lot to the people of Israel. And my Lord was commanded by the Lord to give the inheritance of Zelophehad our brother to his daughters. But if they are married to any of the sons of the other tribes of the people of Israel, then their inheritance will be taken away from the inheritance of our fathers and added to the inheritance of the tribe into which they marry. So it will be taken away from the lot of our inheritance. And when the Jubilee of the people of Israel comes, then their inheritance will be added to the inheritance of the tribe into which they marry, and their inheritance will be taken from the inheritance of the tribe of our fathers. And Moses commanded the people of Israel according to the word of the Lord, saying, The tribe of the people of Joseph is right. This is what the Lord commands concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. Let them marry whom they think best, only they shall marry within the clan of the tribe of their father. The inheritance of the people of Israel shall not be transferred from one tribe to another, for every one of the people of Israel shall hold on to the inheritance of the tribe of his fathers. And every daughter who possesses an inheritance in any tribe of the people of Israel shall be wife to one of the clan of the tribe of her father, so that every one of the people of Israel may possess the inheritance of his fathers. So no inheritance shall be transferred from one tribe to another, for each of the tribes of the people of Israel shall hold on to its own inheritance. So here is where we read maybe most explicitly about the perpetual nature of the inheritance. All right, so we saw earlier that the inheritance is to be given by lot, so God wills where everybody goes. And here we see that the result of that is to be perpetual. That's part of the complaint of these men, that the Let's see now. Oh yeah, so the complaint is that if they marry into another tribe, the land, this is quoting from what we just read, will be taken away from the lot of our inheritance. Right, so God's will in this matter is going to end up being subverted by the daughters of Zelophehad marrying into another tribe. So that is the central problem. And that is a problem because the inheritance is supposed to be perpetually tied to the clan that received it. This is why, by the way, most inheritance in the ancient world was patrilineal. It keeps things really simple when you think about it, to just pass things on from father to son. It ensures that property is held within the same clan. In the ancient world, whenever women inherit, it leads to property-changing families once the women marry outside of the family. It's like we explained a few weeks ago. This is also kind of the same motive for incest. And there the law has to fight against that inclination and say that's not legitimate to marry that closely within the family just to keep the inheritance within the family. But the law recognizes the legitimacy of that desire to keep the inheritance within the clan because it's ordained by God. So the law's solution to this is to forbid inheriting daughters from marrying outside of their clan. Now, that's, again, and I feel like I should probably continue to say this with some of the topics that we look at. A lot of this is meant descriptively and not prescriptively. In other words, whenever we read the law of Moses, I think we should be careful to discern where the law is addressing ancient culture where it stood, like where it was at, versus where the law is actually promoting a standard of behavior that should be eternal. So in this particular case, right, what's the law telling us? Is the law telling us that inheritance should always be patrilineal, that the ancient way of doing things is forever the approved way of doing things? I don't think that's necessarily the case. All right, the law is not trying to promote patrilineal inheritance to us. What it is trying to impress upon us, though, is the importance and the legitimacy of inheritance, and treating people fairly, and taking care of the needs, especially of those who are going to end up marginalized otherwise. Right? Because what happens to Zelophehad's daughters if they don't inherit? They have no prospects at all in the ancient world. Right? They are literally, their only option is essentially starvation or begging, which, again, like we've said before, for women in the ancient world, almost always leads to prostitution. So this is from an ancient perspective, this is a rather sophisticated way of making sure, like setting up safeguards against that. Now, the only reason that safeguard has to be there is because of patrilineal succession in the first place. Right? No, this would not be a problem if patrilineal inheritance was not a thing, right? If women could just inherit, there wouldn't be any need for that. So I think it's important to discern in that way. That gives us a pretty thorough look, though, at what the law of Moses has to say about inheritance, at least just at the legal level, and how it works. I want us to finish out with some spiritual applications that we learn from the inheritance in the law of Moses. Understanding the spiritual application, because remember, God uses the law to teach Israel spiritual truths. And understanding the spiritual application of the inheritance hinges on this association between inheritance and the afterlife or immortality. This is something that's really common in the ancient world, but we find especially common in Israel. Remember, Israel, by the way, doesn't exactly have a fleshed out, fully defined understanding of the afterlife. If you look for it in the law, it's just not there. God does not spell it out for Israel. And so there's this generic understanding that the dead go to Sheol. But that really just amounts to, well, where do the dead go? Well, the dead go to the place where the dead go. Right? That's essentially Israel's answer. Insofar as, is there existence after death? Maybe, maybe not. If someone exists, maybe they are sensible. In other words, they can actually perceive what's going on. Maybe not. Now, you broaden out to the rest of the Old Testament, and you can see Israel starting to develop some sense of the resurrection late in their history. But again, it's not in the law. For most of its history, Israel assumes that life after death consists mainly of living on through your descendants and through your land. This is the concern that we saw in the daughters of Zelophehad when they worried that their father's name would be cut off, and that Zelophehad essentially ceases to exist if he does not have an inheritance in Israel. This is an afterlife question. This is also seen in the concern of Tamar for her deceased husband Er in Genesis 38. There's a reason why Tamar goes through all of this trouble to secure a child. Onan is to raise up offspring for his brother, but he refuses. Right? And God puts him to death for that, because Onan has essentially become a murderer in what he has done. He is willing to make his brother disappear rather than split the inheritance further with him. All right. Remember, if Er's not around, all right. So you've got three sons. You've got Er, Onan, and Shelah, and it goes back to that hypothetical case that we talked about earlier. If Judah dies, he has three sons to pass his property along to. It's split 4 ways, and Er gets the double portion. Onan and Shelah each get a quarter. But if Er is dead, and if he has no inheritance, then it just gets split 3 ways, and Onan now gets a double portion. So he gets 2/3. That's a huge jump from 1/4 of the property to 2/3 of the property. So Onan is motivated by greed, but to do that, he is willing to snuff his brother's name out forever. And that's why Tamar goes through all of that trouble. Right? We see that same kind of concern is specifically the concern for the land with the patriarchs. Remember, their concept of the afterlife consists of living on through your descendants in your land. All right, so you look at the patriarchs. They all have to be buried in the promised land. Even though they don't technically own it yet, that's the symbol of their faith in the Lord's promise. They know that the Lord has guaranteed it to them and their descendants, and so they want to be buried there. So Abraham, whenever he dies, right, he practically dies there, so he's buried there. Jacob dies in Egypt, and his bones are taken back, his body's taken back to be buried in the cave of Machpelah. Joseph, he dies in Egypt, and his bones are preserved the entire time that the nation of Israel is there in Egypt. This is the one way that we know that Joseph has fully come around at the end of Genesis and repented of dissociating from his family earlier. That now he is laying full claim on the promises of the God of Israel. He wants his bones taken back there. So Israel has this understanding of the afterlife that to us, having the full revelation of God, This strikes us as bizarre. But look at what God does. God uses that understanding to begin to teach Israel about his spiritual promises. Right? So God, and notice God doesn't do this with us either, right? If God were to come down and hit us with all the knowledge, it would destroy us. Right? There are things that we're going to learn in the resurrection that we have no inkling of now. But Israel works in a lot of the same way. If God were to come down and just completely shatter everything, again, he would shatter them as a people. He would shatter them as a nation. So he begins with them as they are, and he uses their understanding, incomplete as it is, to begin teaching them a fuller understanding of things. And he uses their understanding of how the inheritance of the land couples with the afterlife. He uses that to begin teaching them spiritual lessons, right? So, for example, this is just a quick example. Those who commit grave sins in Israel are to be cut off from Israel. That is, they receive no inheritance. Now, by the way, if they receive no inheritance, where does that inheritance go to? Hold on to that question, because we're going to come back around to it. And we'll do that in the same context in which we explain how the commandment against false witness is also a property law. We'll come back to that. But those who commit grave sins are to be cut off from Israel. This prefigures our understanding of hell. Right? They have no part in Israel. They have no inheritance. They are destroyed. Right? They are obliterated. And that ultimately prefigures the understanding of hell that we receive in the New Testament. Right? It's a perpetual condemnation. We think specifically of Dathan and Abiram, right? Korah's co-conspirators in the rebellion. And that is demonstrated very viscerally, very literally. Right? The ground swallows them up. They go down alive into Sheol, and they are cut off from Israel. Dathan and Abiram don't have any heirs in Israel. Korah does, right? And we've explained that situation in other places. Korah is a very special example of God's mercy. But Dathan and Abiram, as we see the ground opening up underneath them, in the modern conception of it, you can't help but see them being swallowed alive into hell, and that's precisely the idea that we're supposed to get from that episode, I think. On the flip side of things, look at how the Hebrew writer riffs off of the inheritance laws in explaining the work of Christ. Right? He does it really briefly in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 15. He just kind of alludes to it, and he builds on it more later. Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. Right? When you read those words in light of the law of Moses, the only thing you can think about is the promised land given to each clan as an eternal inheritance. Right? The language is all there. And here the Hebrew writer explains to us that perpetual inheritance of the promised land that we read about under the law of Moses is really teaching us about our inheritance in Jesus Christ. Right? The promised eternal inheritance that we receive through him, because his death has redeemed us from the transgressions that we commit. All right, so God uses these things, again, to begin introducing these spiritual lessons through Israel. That concludes our study of the law for this week. I hope that this has been edifying for you. Next week, we'll begin looking at laws about what you can and cannot do with this land that you've inherited. I know there's plenty of other stuff you could inherit as well, what we might call movable property, things like livestock and servants. We will talk about them more in yet another class. Next week, we're going to focus specifically on land. So, until next time, take care. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.